Welcome to the Peepshow Podcast.
Your glance at sex and social justice.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peepshow Podcast. We have a really interesting show for you today. For our main interview, we talked to Reverend Dr. Beverly Dale, who's a Christian minister who has centered her ministry on pleasure and sex positivity. We talked to her about her ministry and what she believes the gospel can contribute to a pleasure-based sex education, as well as a sex work positive and feminist politics. We also bring you live recordings from the Slut Walk in New York City. But first, we have some Peepshow Podcast news. For the news this week, we are going to give you a bit of Peepshow Podcast news, which we've been hinting at for a little bit on Twitter, but now we're ready to actually say what's going on.
The suspense is killing me.
PJ hates it when I speak with suspense.
It's one of your favorite things to do.
Yeah. Anyways, okay, I apologize for my suspense.
I have something really, really important to tell you. But first, you have to listen for 5 minutes about how really, really important it is.
Yeah. When I talk to PJ and I start to tell him stories like this, he's like, "Will you please just tell me the punchline? I can't handle the suspense."
I blame it on anxiety.
Yeah, you can't wade through my preludes because of your anxiety? Yeah, okay.
It's anxiety inducing.
Okay, then without much further ado, I have taken a job with the Pittsburgh City Paper, which is the alt weekly here in Pittsburgh, to do a weekly sex and social justice column in conjunction with this podcast.
Woo!
No, it's like...
You're looking like me, like I need to say something.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to just talk by myself, but okay. I feel silly giving my own news, but...
No, it's a big deal.
It is, okay. Yeah,
it's super exciting.
I will just give you my own news. I was approached from the City Paper about starting a weekly column, a sex column, but because I write and do this podcast on sex and social justice, we are going to frame it as a sex and social justice podcast, where every week I'm going to...
I think you mean column.
Oh, yes. I'm used to saying podcast. Yes, a sex and social justice column, the Peep Show column. Basically, the Peep Show podcast is partnering with the Pittsburgh City Paper to bring weekly sex and social justice news
across multiple platforms.
Across multiple platforms, one in writing and one on the podcast, which means that folks who are on the podcast as guests, I will also be writing up for the Pittsburgh City Paper in one way or another. So we're super excited to be able to share the work that we've been doing on the podcast with our community here in Pittsburgh and broaden it beyond just the sex work community to the larger sex positive communities. Yeah.
One of the neat things is that we've always sort of taken pride in being the Rust Belt, Midwestern, situated podcast and sharing stories that may not be being covered in a lot of the stuff that's coming out of, New York and San Francisco, where, I don't know, most of the sex podcasts and writing and other sorts of things come out of. And so what's neat about taking this gig is that you're kind of doubling down on that, and you're going to be connecting up what we're doing for folks across the country and across the world on our podcast, and then also hooking that into a lot of local goings-ons in Pittsburgh and kind of in the Rust Belt more broadly. And so I'm kind of excited to experiment with and think more about our
situation here in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and like what makes us unique, and maybe hopefully having the opportunity to do some more shows and
yeah, we're certainly hoping to do some live shows here in Pittsburgh. We're hoping to feature some Pittsburgh local sex workers and artists and activists.
Yeah, and maybe we'll do a special episode on sex work in the Rust Belt or something in the future. Still very much in the brainstorming phase, but I think this is going to really help give us a platform to take the podcast, which we've loved doing for the past year, and also pepper in some local flair while we're doing it.
Yeah.
And that's going to be really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we're just very excited to be able to have a writing platform that will work in conjunction with our podcast.
We feel really strongly about what we're doing, and we're really proud of the show. And we really feel like we've told a lot of important stories, and that we've, the interviews we've done so far, the people we've been able to platform so far mean an awful lot to me.
Right.
And
I
think we've got a lot of really great feedback that it's meant a lot to a lot of you folks out there who really value hearing voices and perspectives, that resonate with you, that you don't get to connect with as often as you'd like. Or for some people, just to be exposed to something totally new and outside of their...
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that's going to be really fun about doing this column is that we have had a fairly heavy sex work focus this year as we've been doing the podcast, and a lot of our audience has come out of our own sex work community, and obviously it extends beyond that to a lot of other sex positive people. But being in a mainstream major publication and pulling this podcast into that publication, we feel like it's going to open up to a whole new audience. So the sort of message that we've been giving about sex worker rights issues, about social justice for sexual minorities,
and just humanizing people in the community.
Yeah, and humanizing people in the community, I think that we're going to now be able to even be more effective at that. And we're super excited about that aspect of it.
Yeah, totally.
So the paper comes out every Wednesday, and my first column is going to appear the first Wednesday in October. So I believe that is October 3rd. So be on the lookout for that. And it's going to come out every Wednesday after that.
Awesome. And one final tidbit, a little production note before we launch into the new segment where we're covering the Slut Walk in NYC. I just wanted to mention, I'm kind of excited. I really was motivated after we did our special episode at the Blood Bunny exhibit, also in NYC in Brooklyn.
We keep going back there.
Yeah. No, we captured some really cool field audio, and it was really fun to mix that together. And I decided I wanted to kind of double down, and I really felt like one of the great things we can do as a podcast is to try to immerse you all and bring you all along with us to events that maybe you aren't able to travel to or attend. So as a producer and kind of sound engineer for the podcast, we invested in some new microphones, even got a pair of binaural microphones.
I don't know what that word means. But he's been talking about it nonstop, so I think it's really exciting.
It is exciting. And we don't have to nerd out on what it means, other than for you, the listeners, it will be particularly exciting to listen to this segment with headphones on. To experience the full three-dimensional depth of the recordings.
Once we get really good at this for the podcast, we're going to start some ASMR porn. Oh, sorry.
Or said it.
It's just like a fantasy. Go ahead.
I'm really excited to have gotten the opportunity to experiment with some new tools, and I'm eager to hear what you all think. And if you enjoy this kind of coverage and these sorts of field recordings, maybe we could call them audio postcards of events.
I like that.
I think it's like an NPR term that
I
stole.
know.
But
it's good.
If you like us bringing you these kinds of coverage, we'd love to know, because it's definitely something we'll consider doing more of in the future.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So big news for Peepshow Podcast this week.
decide what to do with your body. It should not be illegal for two consenting adults to have sex, which is why I'm here today to stand alongside them and to remind them that they are not alone. The reason of this march is to tell religious institutions, once again, the reason of this march is to tell religious institutions that what is need to govern in the world is love and respect for others. Whatever a person decides to do with his or her own body is her own business. There are many kids dying of hunger around the world, and for this reason they should unite and fight, and not mind what people do with their own body. Because my ass is my ass, and I decide what to do with it. Okay, because my ass is my ass, and I decide what to do with it.
Bueno, aquí estamos cerrando las palabras para dar inicio a la Marcha de las Putas. ¿A dónde están las putas?
We're in Queens at the Slut Walk that's put on by the Latinx trans community, Latinx trans sex work community. Everything is in Spanish. There's a really good turnout. There was a bunch of speeches, and now everybody who was at the event is marching down one of the main streets together with red umbrellas and trans flags and signage, and there's a couple of people who are announcing chants, and people are chanting, and it's a really great energy and great vibe. Can you tell us who put the march on today?
¿Nos puedes comentar de quién organizó esta marcha?
La marcha la organizó la organización de Lorena Borjas, que es Transgrediendo, que es una marcha que se había venido casi 6 meses hablando o hasta más de esta marcha, porque casi en Jackson High, en Queens, nos catalogan como putas, que siendo o no siendo trabajo sexual, te catalogan por la forma que tú te vistas o como salgas a la calle.
You want me to translate that? Okay. This march was put on by Lorena Borjas' organization. This has been 6 months in the making, and the reason why we had this march, the Marcha de las Putas, is because here in Queens, we are in Jackson Heights, are labeled putas.
Say that again?
We are labeled putas,
Okay.
sluts.
Yeah. Okay.
So, what did the march mean for you all today? Can you tell me a little bit about how it felt to be out marching and what it meant to everybody to be here?
¿Nos puedes comentar un poco de cómo se sintió hoy día, lo que significa para las personas que estuvieron marchando hoy día?
Se sintió un poco intenso, más que nada, porque fue la primera marcha aquí en Queens. Yo digo que la gente también tiene que abrirse su mentalidad de no llamar a todo el mundo putas, porque el trabajo de ser puta también es trabajo.
It felt very intense for it being the first march, and it was an opportunity for the community to see us as more than just putas or sluts or whores, and that it takes a lot for a community to start seeing us differently, because regardless of doing sex work, we are still, ¿qué fue lo último que dijiste? Trabajo sexual.
El trabajo sexual es un trabajo.
Even though we're doing sex work is still work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We would like to thank Jessica Piñaranda from the Sex Worker Project Urban Justice Center for translating for us today. We are here today with Reverend Dr. Beverly Dale, who is an ordained Christian clergy in the Disciples of Christ and has spent most of her 30 plus years in ministry helping people reconnect their spirits and their bodies and confronting sex negativity both in the Christian church and in culture. She teaches an inclusive, science-friendly, and sex-positive Christianity focused on sexual diversity, pleasure, and freedom through Incarnation Institute for Sex and Faith, as well as the Lancaster Theological Seminary. Her upcoming book with Routledge Press is called Advancing the Sexual Health of Christians, Data and Dogma. She can be found on her YouTube series called Sex is Good. I was wondering if you could tell us, to start off with, a little bit about your ministry and how you got into a sex-positive ministry.
I have been on the brunt end of sex negativity in the church. My sexual history includes being sexually abused by an older uncle and date rape and sexual ignorance that created a lot of boundary issues for me and a lot of problems. So I know what happens when people are kept sexually ignorant and when you have a church saying that you're lower class, you're lower because you're female.
Right.
And we certainly did not talk about sex in the church. Now, since my growing up years, of course, the church is too often really into sexuality, but always, from my perspective, on the wrong side of the issue, being very negative and repressive and controlling.
Right.
Not to mention anti-woman. So that's not my Christianity now, but I have felt the wounds of that. And so it took a lot of therapy and education to kind of work my way through that and get my Jesus back that I had as a kid, who really said nothing bad about sexuality as far as I can tell. But I'm on the other side of that healing, and I know there's a lot of people out there who are not. And so that's why I'm doing this work.
Was there a period of time when you thought that you wouldn't be able to gain that back?
Well, I kind of had faith in my Jesus, but not in the church. So I went to seminary when I was in my early 30s to decide whether or not to stay a Christian, frankly.
Wow.
Because I felt very much called to the ministry. I just didn't know if I was called to the church.
Yeah.
So I differentiated. God is not the church. The church sometimes speaks for God and sometimes it doesn't. So I made those very different distinctions.
Yeah.
So when my professor heard that, he said, oh, okay. I mean, he took a deep breath and was a little bit aghast that I had said that. But then he turned me on to some feminist liberation theologians, women who were dissecting some of those awful passages in the scripture. And I learned to read in the context of the times.
Yeah. Who did they turn you on to? Who were you reading?
But the first book was God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality by Phyllis Tribble, who is a Hebrew scripture. And I knew I had to get back to the Adam and Eve story. And so that's what that book is about, among other passages. And then, I read When God Was a Woman. So I learned to read in the context of the time, and I learned to apply history and sociology to my understanding of scripture. And so that's what helped me to see. And there were all kinds of feminists out there who were writing theology by that time, and womanists. That's the African American women and women of color. So I was able to take advantage of those writings and still do.
Yeah, I mean, I went to seminary too and had really sort of similar experiences, both reading feminist texts, but also reading liberation theology coming out of Latin America, and also reading the African American liberation theology that totally changed my way of thinking about it.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's interesting to hear other people talk about that.
It seems like you're suggesting that a lot of the sex negativity that exists within Christian churches today isn't really necessarily present in the Bible, in the teachings of Jesus himself.
Right. There is certainly sexism, misogyny, and there's a procreationist bias in the scripture. There's no question about that.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it. Yeah.
So we have to read it and understand. Well, let me say that in Deuteronomy, there are a couple places. God says, I set before you life and death. Choose life. And so we have to look at the teachings that tell people to restrict, control pleasure, or restrict and control who they can love, and say, wait a minute, that's leading to death. That is not a choice for life, or life in all of its abundance, as John 10:10 says. So even on that basis alone, we can critique some of the teachings of the church that may come out of the Bible and say, wait a minute, that has nothing to do with choosing life.
I think what you're saying is that while a lot of people have interpreted that to mean that you have to operate under this sort of procreative model that doesn't have anything to do with pleasure, actually we could reframe that and say that choosing life is choosing pleasure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what we were made for. There's a theology book Matthew Fox wrote called We, All the Way Home, A Guide to Sensual Christianity. And he begins a chapter by saying, well, what does God do all day? And the answer is God enjoys God's self and calls God a pleasure-seeking God. And I love that, because if there's one thing that Christianity usually does not teach, it is a pleasure-seeking God.
Yeah.
So that's another thing we have to look at is how do you frame your God? If God is a shame-inducing, judgmental, stern father figure, then that kind of a figure does not lure you to righteous living. That they shame.
Right.
And it's fear-based. It's fear-based on judgment.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't see that. That's not who Jesus was praying to, or the God that Jesus had.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things to me, or one of the things that I got out of being at seminary, was through these feminist texts, rethinking who God is. I remember what I got really influenced by was the way that feminist theologians were reframing Jesus as a mother or a lover or a friend instead of this patriarchal judge, and how changing the way that we think about God can change the way that we think about our relationship to God, ourselves, our place in the world, all of that.
Right. Very much so.
That dominant inherited notion of this judgmental father figure that we have, I don't want to be that. I don't even want to be that with my own children. And I'm not sure that I would want to worship or believe in a figure that I wouldn't even want to be myself. And I actually think that a lot of people do have that image, and yet they criticize, or they're uncomfortable, or have negative feelings about those same attributes in other humans.
But the thing is that if you look at the stories of Jesus in the Gospels, you do not see that kind of power-hungry figure. From my perspective, he leveled the playing field, that he was as likely to heal a leper as he was a wealthy person.
Right.
He had no problems talking to people who were pushed to the margins. That's an egalitarian model. It's not a patriarchal model.
Yeah.
But the writers who eventually wrote down the stories and who eventually created the theology of the Christian church around the body were in a patriarchal society, heavily patriarchal, and dominating over other bodies, and certainly over women, or bodies that were non-conforming or different. So yeah, that's reflected in those texts, but not in the biblical text.
Do you think that the problem with the church is more of a cultural problem, and that the church moved too far away from the original message? Or what do you think went wrong that created such sex negativity?
Well, I think what's important is don't underestimate the power of the patriarchy to strike fear in the hearts of everybody.
Yeah.
Because a patriarchal system, it's a domination system that's a few bodies are worthwhile and the rest of us are not, for any number of reasons: color of skin, gender, orientation, so forth. What's holding that together is fear. So the church then gets into, all right, so we've got to fear God, and we have to fear being on the outside, so the church won't give us the sacraments. We don't want that. We don't want judgment. In the evangelical communities, there's this strong focus on building and keeping a real strong sense of identity and community, that these people in small groups of large churches, they really do care about each other. And the flip side of that is they really do have a vested interest in keeping everybody conforming to the way they have decided everybody should live, in terms of our bodies and in terms of our sexual expression. So fear of being ostracized, a fear of God's judgment, fear of losing access to the sacraments. I mean, any number of things keep people from thinking more liberatively, which is what I think Jesus was about, and it got him crucified. Okay, so let's just be real clear that that's what happens.
Yeah.
When you buck the system.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I think we should go back to talk about the life of Jesus, because I think it's relevant to what you're saying. First of all, yeah, I mean, he did try to buck the system, and that didn't turn out well for him. Can you talk a little bit about Jesus's relationship to women?
Yes, I can. But before we get to that question, I think it's important to acknowledge that while it didn't turn out well for him, in the sense that got him crucified.
Right.
He was empowering a heck of a lot of people around him who were not empowered before.
Yeah.
So in the early church, we find women out there in positions of leadership, hosting house churches.
Mm-hmm.
They were acknowledged as leaders in the Christian movement. Lepers, people who were foreigners and so forth, were also being elevated as and treated fairly and genuinely, compassionately in that early church.
Yeah.
So I don't want to discount that. So the leader may get shot down, but once you've started liberating people, there's perhaps no going back.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's what happened. Okay, so Jesus' relationship to women seemed to me was very empowering. And the story that I really love is Mary and Martha's story, where he actually almost explicitly violates gender norms, where Mary chooses to stay in the room with the men, and Martha, her sister, complains that she's not doing the work that a woman should be doing in the kitchen. And Jesus' response is that she has chosen the better thing. In other words, if your gender role conflicts with your spirituality, then you need to follow the Spirit. And that's what she did. She was listening at his feet, taking in everything that he was teaching the men.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty significant story.
Yeah. It's actually interesting, going forward several hundred years. I think it's interesting. I've also heard a lot of scholars talk about, particularly within like medieval mysticism, of rethinking Jesus as not playing into gender norms either, or as being like gender queer in a way. I mean, that's completely anachronistic, but I think it would be interesting to think about Jesus as advocating for gender nonconformity in a way, but also doing that himself.
Mm-hmm. But it's a little off track, but I think the scripture, when he talks about eunuchs, might be appropriate there, because there was sexual diversity around Jesus through the eunuchs. And his statement was there are people who are eunuchs who were that way at birth.
Mm-hmm.
Others were made that way, and others choose that way. And that was the perfect time for him to be critical of people who did not fit a norm of sexuality.
Right.
And he did not. He certainly did not.
Yeah.
There's another passage, you'll recall, I believe it's in Matthew, in which he uses the word raca, R-A-C-A. If you use the word raca, you are in danger of going before the council or something like that. Nowadays, many of the new translations substitute fool, but there is a researcher by the name of Roscoe, I think it's Will Roscoe, who writes that they have now discovered what that word means, and it is Malakoi, and it's a word that is used to describe effeminate men. So Roscoe's perspective is that actually Jesus is saying if you bash somebody because of their gender or gender nonconformity,
right,
you are in danger, of the council. So I'm not sure what that is, some kind of a whatever in the Jewish system, but he's condemning people who would in turn call names and bully other people. So there are not a lot of passages that kind of support this, except that he certainly wasn't critical of women who touched him in public when they weren't supposed to, or in private, using their hair to wipe his feet. I mean, all that was violating the rules, specifically the religious rules of the day, which is religious/cultural. And he had no problem with that. So I think we can infer from that it's okay to be a rule breaker.
Yeah.
Whenever it gets in the way of relationships or whenever it gets in the way of healing, we violate the rules.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that Jesus kept the company of a lot of current or former prostitutes. We're not really sure, but that some of his followers had that background. That's something that a lot of people seem to speculate.
I think the woman at the well is the best example, because the women did not go to the well in the middle of the day, and she did.
Okay.
So she was a Samaritan, which meant she was an outsider, a foreigner, if you will, and she was at the well when there would not be other women there. So there was some reason why she was there.
What do they think that the reason she was there was?
Who knows? But we do learn in that story that she had 5 husbands and she was living with a 6th one who was not hers. So that tells you that she was violating some kinds of sexual norms, and she was probably being ostracized from the community. And Jesus had no trouble talking theology with her as an equal. She challenged him and he responded. And it convinced her that this guy knew what he was talking about. And she was really excited about leaving his presence to go tell all of her friends that, hey, I found somebody who didn't condemn me and who's got some good news for people like me.
Yeah.
And people came because of her story. The piece about Mary Magdalene and being a prostitute, I mean, there's a lot of people who get a lot of good out of that story, but you need to know that the basis of that came from a sermon by a pope who maybe did it unintentionally, or maybe it was deliberate to limit the power of the Mary Magdalene stories that were going around in the church early on. There's no evidence. There are 3 Marys in the scripture. And so he got it confused, basically, intentionally or unintentionally. So I don't usually go there when I talk about prostitution.
So do you think his intent was to discredit Mary Magdalene, right? Because she was kind of like an early disciple.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All 3 of the Marys mentioned, including his mother, were right at the cross, throughout his ministry. All of the Marys, we can assume, were very influential in that early church movement. And we can assume the church at some point began to phase out the women and began to phase out the importance of Mary in the story. So we know that the Gospel of Mary, as a Gnostic gospel, did not get in to the canon.
Right.
So there's a reason for that. All right. I think it's the Gospel of Philip, which also did not get in, but also talks about how Mary and Peter had a disagreement, and that Matthew was the arbiter of that argument, and that Mary was correct in that, not Peter.
That's interesting. Do you think that the reason that Philip didn't make it into the canon is connected to Mary?
Quite possibly.
Or is that very speculative?
Who knows? I mean, we don't know what were the political forces that required some books to get in the canon and some books not to get in the canon.
Right.
We do know that at some point, a whole bunch of those Gnostic Gospels and so forth, as they're called now, were simply hidden out into the desert, were not found until 1948. So there was a reason why those things were hidden. But I think what people fail to appreciate is the political nature in which the canon came to be. There were some people who wanted these books and some people who didn't want those books. And they took votes. And the people with the most power, in the case of, even today, the people with most power get their way.
Right.
And so then they hand it down. And then what we get told is, oh, this is the way God wanted it. This is all God had to say.
Right.
Well, no, that's not really true.
Yeah. It's like a much more complicated and much more political story than that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it does seem important that our interpretations of these stories are kind of mediated or channeled through political decisions that were made over 1,000 years ago.
Well, yeah, and a history that people don't know.
And that was a society where, like you said, it was heavily patriarchal, where there was still slavery, where women in many cases were treated as property. Certainly, like the notion of individual freedom and the stuff that we build our societies around today didn't exist in the same kind of form at all. And clearly it was a very different moment in history and not one that we're necessarily trying to recreate in our own culture.
So what you have to do is look at what is the essence. What is the essence of the gospel? What is it about? And one way to know whether or not it's really a good test is it consistent with other religions?
Right.
And so when you have a Jesus figure saying that all of the law is summarized into love of your God and your neighbor as yourself, all right, that's a pretty universal standard. When you've got the golden rule being taught, treat others as you wish to be treated, as an ethical standard, that's embraced by cultures throughout history. So yeah, I think those are the key principles that we judge our culture by, and judge the church teachings by, and judge the impact on other people by. And we can't go wrong with that. That's the gospel, and that's what he was about.
And that has nothing to do with sexual regulation.
Well, it does and it doesn't. I think I can recognize when someone is being sexually abused.
Oh, sure.
And so
yeah,
it's not a loving action, So I can say that's unjust.
Right.
So it's not as if it's love, and we just all go around with nice, warm, fuzzy feelings towards everybody. No, and that is the fear oftentimes of conservatives, that that's what liberals stand for. Everything's relative, and you don't stand for anything. Well, that's not true.
Right.
That the flip side of love is justice, and so how good are we being to our neighbor? If we're not being good to our neighbor, we're not loving our neighbor, then we have an ethical criteria there that's pretty clear. from the teachings of Jesus.
How have you introduced more of a pleasure-based ethos into a Christian ministry? What does that look like?
Well, in my book that's coming out, which is for sexual health professionals specifically, I've included 4 meditations. One is a Christian meditation on sensuality. One is a sensual hand massage for our couple to do. One is an erotic meditation that we encourage the sex therapist to copy off and hand to their not do that in your
in your
therapeutic
office
session, but hand it to them. So yeah, that's one way. I also have the people that I'm training, the sexologists and the clergy/seminarians. We do some body work. We get in positions with our bodies and show certain feelings, and then work through that. What does that do? Because our body can teach us about what we're thinking, or teach us about our stereotypes and our fears and so forth. The other piece is, I think a lot of what pleasure is about is laughing. And if you've got a Christian, somebody who proposes they're Christian, but they never laugh and they never have fun and they never make jokes, I say, wait a minute, you don't have a pleasure-seeking God here. So do I want to sign up? And I think, no, I don't. And you can, you read some of the scriptures, and Jesus did make some jokes. Sometimes we take life too seriously to live it.
Yeah.
And if we're busy repressing pleasure, not just my pleasure, but other people's pleasure, that's where the whole judgmental thing comes in, then we're not living life as God said to choose life. Really, it's not abundant. So let's incorporate more laughter and pleasure into our lives and into our religion.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, we have a toddler, and he's just, when he's in a good mood anyways, he's just
most of the time, actually.
He's like a ball of laughter, though. It just seems so like such a raw human thing that we almost have to learn to alienate ourselves from. He doesn't even have any words, but yet he finds so many things in the world hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's a really good way to put it. Yeah, that we somehow stop finding everything that pleasurable. Like he has this automatic pleasurable response to things if they're not outright negative.
That's sad that in order to be adult, in order to grow up, you have to lose your sense of humor, or you have to stop finding joy in special little parts on your body, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost like you're breaking off a part of yourself when you do that.
And none of that has a basis in the teachings of Jesus. The whole aesthetic way of being, denial of the flesh, that's what that goes back to. Denial of the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Denial of things. Don't dance, don't put on lipstick, don't have too good of a time, because fear, of course, being that you would lose your commitment to live righteously,
right,
or having too much fun. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think we're probably better righteous people if we're having fun while we do it.
I think what you were saying actually about doing body work is really interesting, because particularly within, not just within Christianity, but within Western culture more generally, starting with Plato, there's this dualism, right? A disconnect between spirit or mind or spirit and body, and a trajectory in which, this is actually what PJ was alluding to too, a trajectory in which to grow up or to become more developed is to cut off from the body. So the idea that part of ministry would then be to reconnect with the body is really interesting to me, because it's so countercultural.
But we have to, because the body has a wisdom and the body has a memory. Mm-hmm. And the body is how we can access spiritual experiences, it seems to me. It's giving birth through the body that many women experience a sacred experience.
Yeah.
Birthing
Mm-hmm.
is a sacred experience for them.
Mm-hmm.
For others, it is some miraculous event that happens in their lives through their bodies. Watching sunsets can be a sacred time where we do that because of our eyes, you see. So to think that we access God through our left brain as an intellectual thing is deeply, deeply flawed.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we can analyze, whether or not a God exists with our left brain. That might be an interesting intellectual exercise. But the question is, maybe not. So we know God through our bodies. And it's bizarre to me that the church has as its major teaching incarnation, God in the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we are the last religion that wants to deal with the flesh. And we certainly don't examine the fact that Jesus may have been married, that Jesus did touch people, that he did eat grilled fish on the beach. I mean, we don't look at the humanity of Jesus and his sensory experiences as a model.
Right.
That's why I called my nonprofit Incarnation Institute for Sex and Faith. It's like, yeah, we've got to get back into our bodies as a way to connect with one another, but also to connect with the sacred.
Even the suffering. I mean, it's the pleasure, but also the suffering, because those are, two sides of the incarnated coin. All those sensory experiences really featured prominently from what I recall, or at least from what I took away from.
I was thinking as you were talking about not just, sensory experiences, but like explicitly like sexual experiences. It's been really interesting to me as I've been working in the sex industry, and particularly through the podcast, through interviewing and talking to a lot of people who are sex workers. One of the things that was so striking to me when I first started this is that when I was in seminary 15 years ago, people framed their being in seminary as a calling. That was a very typical thing to talk about when they were called or how they were called or how they felt called. And there's so many sex workers that we know who frame their experience in sex work in ways that are so similar to that, or seem so similar to that to me.
Or even just call it a calling.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard that phrase many times.
Yeah, call it a calling. And one of the ways that they talk about their experiences and their experiences with clients and the sort of breakthroughs that they have with them is that there's something about being able to offer people touch and sexual experiences, or even for the case of online people who aren't having direct contact, even just tapping into like desire and sexual emotions opens up space for the sacred.
Yeah, and you hear words like healing or restorative.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to say some radical things now here, so hang on.
I'm ready.
I think sex workers offer a very valuable service. And I also think that sex work can be a ministry to other people. People who are lonely or needy or have specific challenges that prevent relationships or sexual intimacy with others. Yeah, I can totally understand that healing can occur when it's mutual.
Right.
Between two equals, and the boundaries are clear, the rules are clear. Yeah, it frees people up then to be real and authentic with one another in ways that can bring healing. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I just think it's interesting to think about how like sexuality and work through the body can be something that can be healing or can feel like a ministry.
Well, you don't have any mandate from Jesus, the stories of Jesus, that's out of bounds at all. I mean, it's about love. And love is not a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling. Love is something that you do. It's how you treat other people and how you treat yourself.
Yeah.
And so I would say that when there's mutual respect between people and an equal sharing of power, if that's what's been negotiated, if that's what's expected, then you've got possibilities for, if you will, quote unquote, a loving relationship to happen.
Yeah.
In the ethical sense.
Right. Yeah, I think all of that is really interesting. And I agree with you. I think that work can be very powerful and very meaningful in people's lives. You're right. Under certain conditions, it can also be in the same way that sexuality can be exploitative or abusive, or, it can be something else too, but it doesn't have to be.
Right. And you have these other principles of like justice and mutual care, or treating other people like you'd want to be treated, especially when we're talking about in the context of the New Testament. Those are also already in there, like,
right.
Implied in what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So going back to you saying that you're going to say something radical, I want to talk to you a little bit about the politics now of how your work is received by other people in ministry. Has there been a lot of pushback against you for saying things like you want to have a pleasure-based Christianity?
No, No, because the right wing hasn't found me yet. But when they
Oh.
find me, they will. Okay. Yeah. My work is with liberals and
Mm-hmm.
progressives inside the church and outside the church. And my peers, my good liberal progressive clergy friends, are appreciative of the work I'm doing, and they understand its importance. But they don't really ask me to fill their pulpits, and they don't they
Yeah.
don't want to know too much about it because they are just as sex phobic as everybody else.
Yeah.
So yeah, I get a lot of, yeah, go girl, go do it, but not a lot of, can we put you on our mission budget kind of thing
I have the
happening.
same experience because I am kind of a rogue academic inside and outside of academia. And I have a lot of progressive academic friends who are like, oh, it's very great that you're doing this work, but who don't want to engage that much with it.
Yeah, go
Right.
find your own funding.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that's really interesting. Like an openness to the idea, but a distance from it as well.
Yeah, because they have to have some healing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have to do is work with the people who already get it, who've gone to the school of hard knocks. They've already learned their lessons that the
Yeah.
church doesn't have all of the answers. In fact, the church can really screw things up sometimes, or the church has done a lot of bashing of people. And those
Right.
are the people who kind of get it. It's, okay, yeah, you can't help me because I'm on the other side. I've already flushed down the toilet, some of this stuff. So those people actually get it
Right.
and appreciate the work and will write the checks and support your ministry and mine.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's the hope.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be. Can I be a little more radical than that?
Yeah. Go ahead.
In these cultural times of increasing anti-woman through the anti-contraception, ignorant statements being made about abortion and contraception by Supreme Court nominee,
Mm-hmm.
some of those kinds of things that are happening. Those of us who are pleasure lovers and pleasure seekers, not irresponsible hedonists, I make the distinction,
Sure.
okay? All right.
Yeah.
Those of us who grasp the life-giving possibilities of pleasure,
Yeah.
when there's ethics and morals attached to that, we have to speak up now.
Yeah.
This is the antidote. We have to bring the healing to those people who are doing god awful things
Yeah.
in the name of this government, and oftentimes in the name of some church or some theology that's really horrific against children and against the bodies of black men and against people in the prisons. I mean,
Yeah.
on and on and on. Bodies are being targeted because certain people have real conflict about the body.
Yeah.
All you have to do is look at some key people in our government to understand that they're deeply sexually conflicted. I mean, Paul
Yeah.
Ryan put out a memo saying the women reporters had to cover their shoulders. He didn't want their bare shoulders
Oh my God, I didn't realize
showing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've got a Vice President Pence who refuses to be in a room with a woman by himself. I mean, this is
Yeah, I
deep,
did-
deep sexual
Yeah.
confliction.
Yeah.
And then not to mention, the person in the White House who has got a reputation for sexually assaulting women and bragging about it. I mean,
Mhm.
we're not talking about people who are sexually satisfied and fulfilled. We're talking about
Right.
people who are deeply conflicted.
There's a lot of men in positions of power who have these sort of, deep conflicts.
So I think those of us who embrace a pleasure as a good, straight from God, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
and those of us who have gone through some sexual healing, we've got to be naming the dysfunction for what it is, and we have to start advocating for pleasure
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
advocating for sexual liberation for all people, however that looks.
Yeah.
Where the church is in all of this, I think the moderate, liberal, and progressive Christians want to be accepting of the divorced person or the gay person or the trans person in their churches or communities, but they don't speak out and they're not able to advocate for liberation because of sexual ignorance themselves and because they unhealed trauma themselves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And nobody's really done the work of really putting it together, as I'm trying very concretely to do, to make the link between Christian theology of God being a fleshly person
Yeah.
walking among us and how we walk among one another, how we carry ourselves sexually.
Mm-hmm.
How do we apply his teachings and his life example to our sexual lives and example? Nobody's really done that work. feminists, I think, have laid the groundwork. And womanists certainly are putting in the piece here. It's not just about gender, for example, or orientation. It's really also about how we treat bodies, period. But
Right.
particularly people of
Mm-hmm.
color, class issues, and so forth.
Yeah.
So so much evil occurs because of ignorance.
Yeah. I think this is all really, really interesting. And I think that you're absolutely right. I think that one of the important things here is that advocacy right now is really important. And advocacy for pleasure, for a sort of sex positivity, for love and kindness too, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we've got to have fun while we're doing it.
Yeah.
It's not all about
Mhm.
fighting and rallying and so forth. We've got to understand that life is to be enjoyed, and these bodies are for pleasure. And so we've got to have fun while we're lifting up an alternative to a very sour, dour, judgmental, shame-filled, guilt-filled religion.
I think that's so important because for anyone who works in any sort of advocacy or activism, it can be like grinding work that'll start to wear on you for a while, especially in a
Definitely.
political climate right now where things just seem to get worse and worse. And I think it's easy to lose sight of the main of the goal. It's easy to lose sight of the goal and to just get bogged down by like an endless fight. And the idea that we should keep in mind that we should also be enjoying
But not just
our
the
lives.
goal, but to like take energy from your community and from other people and from yourself, and to find that motivation and
Yeah.
that joy in the work that you're doing, and not just feel defeat all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
To remember why you're there in the first place and why you're passionate about these things.
Right.
And when we connect with other people, when we are in relationship with other people in a loving way, that means in an ethical and moral way, then that opens up possibilities for understanding the sacred in a whole new way.
You know what? That brings up one other issue that I kind of wanted to loop back into. You're talking about Jesus's relationship to the lepers. And I've been thinking about that and the kind of idea of stigma, what kind of the modern day lepers are, and like who are those stigmatized groups that people aren't willing to associate with or aren't willing to stand up for. Of course, I'm thinking of sex workers and our sex workers' rights movements and the difficulty we have finding mainstream advocacy for our cause. But also just, I was reflecting back on a lot of those readings and the idea of that there's something like really powerful, and even part of what makes Jesus' story compelling is that seeming lack of fear around stigma, like that willingness to just look stigma in the eye and ignore it and just see a human being. I wish we had more of that impulse today. Like, I wonder where that impulse has gone, particularly in Christianity.
Well, I know that some of the work on empathy, of the science on that, is that as a species, we are a very empathic species. That we do rush to save the babies and so forth.
Yeah.
But here's the difference. If we know them.
Yeah.
So we're incredibly empathic if it's happening to someone in my town or in my church. But we are not so empathic with across divisions of some kind. So in the other town, the other state, another race, another class of people, then we're not quite so empathic. So for me, that's one of the main reasons for all religion, is to remind ourselves that to go against our biological impulse to only be empathic to people who are like us or whom we know.
The idea that one of the functions of religion is to push people's empathy past the boundaries of just towards their own, like people like themselves, is actually really interesting. I've never heard anyone say that like that before.
I think this idea of like empathy seems really important. Learning empathy, or learning to extend the empathy that we naturally develop for those who are in close proximity to us. You know, the broader humanity.
Right.
In the world.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of a survival mentality. I mean, at some biological level, we know to be fearful of strangers lest they are going to eat us, you know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we see that with our baby who, when somebody else walks in, comes over to us. There
Yeah,
is something hardwired about that. I think that we could relate this to what you were saying much earlier in the interview when you were saying that we need to have some sort of a sense of where we have come from and how we've gotten the sort of theology that we have, the structure of the church, without being reflective as to why we operate the way that we do. I think you can't have a lot of change. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the central ideas of probably all religions, but I won't go there, but certainly the Christian church is that Jesus prayed that they may be one, that
Yeah.
we are all one. And when you've got a Genesis story at the very beginning that said all of this is good,
Yeah.
all of it is very good, actually. So that would seem to imply that all of these boundaries that we make around our little village or around these political parties or whatever is really superfluous, and we should be getting rid of them. That the heart of the Christian story, or the heart of this, any spiritual understanding, is that we are one with one another,
Right.
Right.
and that transgresses all national boundaries, for example, or
Mm-hmm.
the way you practice sexuality versus the way I do.
So, if you were going to say that you think it's important for people to understand one or two main things in order to have a more positive experience with their own sexuality, what do you think those would be?
The one key one is that we do not appreciate that we are each made in the image of the divine.
Mm.
That is crucial to understand, that who you are, who you look like, how you are in the world is very special and unique. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, was absolutely right. There's not anyone else like you. That makes you
Mm-hmm.
very special. He didn't say because God made you that way, but at
Mm-hmm.
least not on the show, but that certainly was his theology.
Right.
And then, if we really believe that, then when other people try to put us down because of insert characteristic or whatever,
Right.
then we wouldn't fall for it.
Yeah.
A friend of mine says that what other people think of you is none of your business. All right, so you see, isn't that great?
I do. I
That's
really
I
like
don't know.
that.
All right. So if we had a strong sense of self and worth,
Mm-hmm.
that we are all worth something very special in God's eyes, if you want to use that language,
Yeah.
then what other people think is like, well, too bad. We go around once in life, so make it the best that it can be,
Right.
but make sure it's your values and not the values of the world
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
that will nurture you and feel, yes, my life has meaning and purpose, and I am worthwhile. So those are kind of the key ideas, I think. I think
Yeah.
there's another piece about here, that the church basically teaches that there's a scarcity of love, that you
Yeah.
can only feel warm, fuzzy feelings and new relationship energy with a spouse you have a piece of paper legalizing that relationship with. And I think
Mm-hmm.
we need to understand that there's lots of love out there in unexpected places,
Mm-hmm.
and unexpected people. But if we only think it's only in one place, and that's all we'll see it.
Yeah.
And we just have to open our eyes and say, no, God is love. God is everywhere. So there's love all around us. So how do we go out and touch it? How do we find it? How do we take it in? And then how do we let it back out to those around us as well?
Yeah.
So I would like to see us all envision love / God / mystery, whatever you want to call it, as like the air that we breathe. And we all need to be breathing in, yes, life is good, life is wonderful, I am worthy and loved, and then breathing it out to those people around us. That's going to create social change.
Yeah. That's a really beautiful note to end on.
Yeah.
I think. Where are people going to be able to find your book, and where can they find your other work?
Well, the book is for sexual health professionals. It'll be out in March or April. So I don't know if that'll be helpful to people, Advancing Sexual Health for the Christian Client, Data and Dogma. But the next book I'll be working on will be for people in the pews, or people like yourselves who want to have a different way of being. I guess my webinar series would be what I would say people are really serious about this. There's a webinar on how and when, under what circumstances to have sex, how we got to be sexually negative in the church. There's 4 of them. Purchase them separately or together. It's called Reading the Bible, with sex-positive eyes.
Oh,
And for
neat.
those who just want a little bit of something, the website is incarnationinstitute.org. We have some resource sheets there, 10 Commandments of Good Sexual Relationship, how to find a gay-friendly church, how to know if your church is sex-positive, a number of those kinds of things people can try. And then, of course, you can always go to YouTube and look up Sex is Good. I have some interesting conversations happening there.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peepshow Podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/PeepshowPodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.